My name is Eleanor. I am 65 years old, and 3 days before my daughter's wedding, she looked me straight in the eye in my own kitchen and said the words that would end everything between us. "Mom, I need you to not come." I thought I misheard her. I asked her to repeat it. She didn't even flinch. "You'll ruin the aesthetic," she said. "The photos are curated. Everything is themed. And you look old, Mom. I'm sorry, but it's true. Grandma old. It doesn't fit." I stood there in silence, holding a dish towel, in the same kitchen where I had once bandaged her scraped knees, where I had stayed up until 4 a.m. helping her build a science project out of cardboard and hope, where I had cooked 10,000 meals so that she never once went to bed hungry. And she was telling me I didn't fit. I want you to remember that moment, because 2 days later, at the most expensive wedding venue in the city, I would walk in wearing a simple gray coat, carrying nothing but my purse and a single folded note. And by the time I walked out, the wedding of the year would be hanging by a single thread, a thread only I was holding. This is the story of how a mother was erased from her own daughter's biggest day, and how, without raising my voice, without a single scene, without ever saying a cruel word, I made sure the truth walked through those doors, whether anyone wanted it to or not. Let me take you back, not to that kitchen, further back, to understand why those words cut so deep. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I raised my daughter Claire alone. Her father left when she was 4 years old, and he never looked back. No calls, no birthdays remembered, nothing. It was just the two of us in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Ohio, living on a nurse's salary that barely stretched to the end of each month. I worked double shifts at the hospital for years. I remember coming home at 6 a.m, smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion, just in time to make Claire's breakfast and walk her to school. I remember selling my mother's wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry I owned that meant anything, so Claire could go on her 8th grade class trip to Washington, D.C. I never told her that. I let her believe it was extra savings. When Claire got into college, a private university with a price tag that made my hands shake when I saw the tuition bill, I didn't hesitate. I took out loans. I picked up weekend shifts. I skipped vacations, skipped new clothes, skipped almost everything for myself for 12 straight years, so that my daughter could walk across that graduation stage with a diploma and 0 debt. She used to call me her hero. She used to say, "Mom, when I get married, you're walking me down the aisle, not some guy." I believed her. I held on to that promise through every hard year. Then Claire met Julian. Julian came from money, old money, the kind with a family name on a hospital wing and a summer house that had its own name. His mother, Margaret, was the kind of woman who complimented you while somehow making you feel 2 inches shorter. The first time I met her, at a dinner Claire arranged, Margaret looked at my discount department store blazer and said, "Oh, how charming. Practical clothing." I do admire practicality. I smiled and said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that some battles aren't worth fighting at a dinner table. But something changed in Claire after she started spending more time with Julian's family. She began correcting the way I spoke. She began wincing at the restaurants I chose. She started saying things like, "Mom, you don't have to bring up the nursing shifts every time we're around Julian's friends," or, "Can you maybe not mention that you clip coupons?" It's just a lot. I told myself it was just wedding stress. Brides get anxious. Brides say things they don't mean. I told myself that the daughter who once slept in my arms during thunderstorms, who once wrote me a card that said, "You are my whole world, Mommy," was still in there somewhere. I was wrong, and I was about to find out exactly how wrong, in the cruelest way possible. The wedding planning began nearly a year before the ceremony, and from the very first meeting I noticed something. Claire had stopped asking for my opinion. She had stopped asking for my help. I didn't understand why at first, because I was the one paying for almost the entire wedding. Let me be clear about that, because it matters for everything that comes later. Julian's family had money, yes, old money, the kind that sits quietly in trust funds and doesn't get touched. But Margaret made it very clear early on that the bride's family traditionally handles the venue and the primary costs. That old-fashioned tradition, conveniently, meant that the entire financial weight of a wedding that would cost well over $100,000 would fall almost entirely on me. I didn't argue. I wanted to give my daughter the wedding of her dreams. I had spent 30 years sacrificing for her. So what was one more sacrifice? I liquidated part of my retirement fund. I remortgaged the small house I had worked so hard to pay off. I wrote a deposit check for the venue, the Ashford Manor Estate, a gorgeous sprawling property with manicured gardens, and a ballroom that looked like something out of a European palace for $50,000. $50,000. Money I had spent decades building. Money that represented every double shift, every skipped vacation. Every year I told myself, someday I'll rest. I paid it gladly. Because I loved my daughter. Because I believed foolishly that love like that gets remembered. As the months went on, small things started happening. I would suggest a flower arrangement, and Claire would say, "Julian's mom already picked something similar. It's fine." I would offer to help address invitations, and she'd say, "The wedding planner is handling it. Don't worry about it." Slowly, quietly, I was being moved from the center of my daughter's life to somewhere near the edge of the guest list. I told myself it was normal. I told myself every mother goes through this, the slow, natural process of letting your child build a life that isn't about you anymore. But normal doesn't feel like being erased. And that's exactly what was happening. 3 days before the wedding, Claire came to my house. I remember I had just finished ironing the dress I planned to wear, a soft champagne-colored dress I had saved for months to buy. Nothing flashy, nothing that would outshine anyone, just something that made me feel a little bit beautiful for my own daughter's wedding. Claire sat down at my kitchen table. She looked nervous, but I assumed it was ordinary wedding jitters. Then she said it. "Mom, I need to talk to you about the wedding day. I think it's better if you don't come." I laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke, some strange bridal humor I didn't understand. She didn't laugh back. "Julian's family has a certain image," she continued, not quite meeting my eyes. "The photographer we hired, he's very particular about the aesthetic. Everything has been curated down to the smallest detail, the color palette, the styling, even who stands where in photos. And Mom, I love you, but you don't fit that image. You look older than the other guests. Your style is different. I'm worried it'll throw off the whole feel of the pictures." I sat completely still. I felt something crack open in my chest, slow and silent, like ice breaking under weight. "I'm 65 years old, Claire," I said quietly. "I am your mother. What did you think I would look like?" I know, I'm not trying to be cruel," she said, her voice cracking slightly, though I noticed she never once said she'd changed her mind. It's just Margaret suggested that maybe it would be smoother if the ceremony stayed more. Immediate family of Julian's side plus close friends. You could come to the reception dinner afterward, maybe, just not the ceremony, not the photos. I asked her the question that had been building inside me for months. Did you come up with this? Or did Margaret? Claire's silence answered for her. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A mother who sold her wedding ring for a school trip, who worked double shifts for 12 years to pay for a private university, who remortgaged her home and drained her retirement to fund a $50,000 venue deposit, told 3 days before the wedding that she wasn't allowed to walk through the front doors of the ceremony she was paying for because she looked too old. I did not scream. I did not cry in front of her, though I promise you the moment she left, I sat alone in my kitchen and wept in a way I hadn't wept since her father walked out the door 28 years earlier. But somewhere in that grief, something else was quietly forming. Not rage exactly, something colder, something clearer, because Claire had made one very serious mistake. She thought that being told not to come to the ceremony meant that everything else, the money, the contracts, the checks with my name signed on them, would simply continue on autopilot without her mother's involvement. She forgot who was actually holding the financial strings of that entire wedding. I said only one thing to Claire before she left my house that day. Okay, that was it. One word. No argument, no pleading, no tears in front of her. Just, okay, I watched something flicker across her face, maybe surprise, maybe relief, maybe a flash of guilt she quickly buried. She probably expected a fight. She probably braced herself for me to cry, to beg, to make a scene the way people do in movies. Instead, I calmly walked her to the door, hugged her stiffly, and closed it behind her. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and I began to think, not about revenge, not at first. I want to be honest with you. My first instinct wasn't anger, it was grief. Pure, hollow grief, the kind that makes your chest physically ache. But grief has a way of clarifying things if you let it sit long enough instead of drowning it in denial. And somewhere around midnight, staring at the folder on my kitchen table, labeled Wedding Ashford Manor, I understood something with complete clarity. I was not just a mother being pushed aside. I was a client, a paying client, with a signed contract whose name was on every deposit, every vendor agreement, every check. Claire and Margaret had spent months planning a beautiful image, the aesthetic, the curated guest list, the perfect photographs. But they had built that entire image on a financial foundation that only I controlled. I opened the folder. I found the venue contract. I found the vendor agreements. I found the deposit receipt with my signature at the bottom for $50,000, a payment that was, according to the venue's own cancellation policy, still within a window where the final balloon payment had not yet cleared, because the remaining $50,000 was due exactly 3 days before the ceremony. 3 days. The exact window I was now sitting in. I picked up my phone. I did not call Claire. I did not call Margaret. I called the venue's finance office. I did not do this out of spite, not purely. I did it because I finally fully understood something that had taken me 65 years to learn. That being kind does not mean allowing yourself to be erased. That respect is not something you beg for. It is something you require. And so quietly, without telling a single soul, I began to make arrangements of my own. Here is what most people don't understand about wedding venues like Ashford Manor. The glamour, the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the perfectly trimmed hedges, none of that runs on good intentions. It runs on contracts. And contracts run on money. I called the venue's finance office the next morning and asked for the general manager directly. Her name was Diane, and she had handled our account personally from the very beginning, because a $50,000 wedding is not a small booking, even for a place like Ashford Manor. I explained, calmly and honestly, that there had been a significant change in the family circumstances surrounding the wedding, and that I needed to review the payment terms of the contract before the final balance was due. Diane pulled up the file. She confirmed what I already suspected. The initial $50,000 deposit, the one I had already paid, was non-refundable, as most deposits are. But the remaining $50,000, covering catering, staffing, floral arrangements, and the exclusive use of the ceremony hall, was due 3 days before the event. That payment had not yet been submitted, because I, the primary account holder, had not yet authorized it. Claire believed, like most brides do, that once a deposit is paid, a wedding simply happens. She had no idea that the largest portion of the bill was still sitting in my hands, waiting for a signature that only I could give. I sat with that information for a long moment. I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind, because this is not a simple story of anger. Part of me wanted to simply pay it anyway. Part of me wanted to be the bigger person, to swallow the pain, to show up to that reception dinner Claire had generously offered me, and smile through it, because that's what mothers are supposed to do, isn't it? Absorb the pain quietly so everyone else's day stays perfect. But then I thought about the note Claire had once written me, years ago. Taped to my bathroom mirror when she was 16, Mom, you deserve someone who fights for you the way you fight for everyone else. I decided, right there at my kitchen table, that the someone who would finally fight for me was going to be me. I did not cancel anything that night. I am not a cruel woman, and I did not want to destroy my daughter's wedding out of blind anger. What I wanted was the truth to be seen. I wanted Claire and Margaret and everyone standing in that beautiful curated aesthetic to understand exactly whose sacrifice had built the ground they were standing on. So I made a decision. I would go to the venue myself in person on the day of the wedding. Not to make a scene at the ceremony, I would never do that. Not to Claire, not really. I would go quietly before the guests arrived and speak with the venue manager directly. And I would bring with me a single note. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 6 a.m., the same time I had woken up for 30 years of double shifts and school mornings. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat in my quiet kitchen and looked out at the small garden I had planted the year Claire left for college roses, because they were her favorite flower when she was young, before roses became too traditional for her curated aesthetic. I got dressed. Not in the champagne dress I had ironed 3 days earlier. I left that hanging in my closet. Instead, I wore a simple, elegant gray coat over a black dress, understated, dignified, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would clash with anyone's carefully designed color palette. Then I sat down at my desk and wrote the note. I want to tell you exactly what that note said, because everything that happened next depended on those few short lines. It read, to the Ashford Manor Management per our contract dated, I am formally withdrawing authorization for the remaining balance payment of $50,000 scheduled for today's event, effective immediately. I remain the sole account holder and signatory on this booking. Please direct all questions to me directly. I will be arriving at the venue at 10 a.m. to discuss the account status in person. Eleanor Whitfield. I folded that note into a plain white envelope, slipped it into my purse, and drove to Ashford Manor. I arrived just after 10 in the morning. The venue was already buzzing with activity florists arranging enormous white arrangements along the aisle. A string quartet warming up in the corner of the ballroom, catering staff wheeling in silver trays. It looked, I'll admit, breathtaking, exactly the kind of wedding a mother dreams of giving her daughter. I found Diane, the general manager, near the entrance, clipboard in hand, coordinating with a team of assistants. She recognized me immediately and smiled warmly. She had no idea, of course, what was in my purse. I asked to speak with her privately for just 5 minutes. She led me into a small office just off the main hall, decorated with soft gold wallpaper and a large window overlooking the gardens, where in a few hours my daughter was supposed to say her vows. I handed her the envelope. She opened it, read it once, then read it again, slower. I watched her face change from polite professionalism to genuine alarm. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said carefully, "are you certain about this? The ceremony is scheduled to begin in 4 hours. If the remaining balance isn't cleared by noon, per the contract, we are not permitted to open the ceremony hall or release catering services. I need to confirm, is this truly what you want?" I looked at her, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 days. Not anger anymore, just quiet, steady clarity. "I am not canceling my daughter's wedding," I said. "I am simply not paying for a wedding I was told I'm not welcome at." Diane, to her credit, handled the situation with complete professionalism. She explained that per the contract, she was obligated to notify the point of contact listed for day of coordination, which happened to be the wedding planner Claire and Margaret had hired. Within 20 minutes, my phone rang. It was Margaret. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to steady my breath first. "Eleanor," Margaret said, and for the first time since I had known her, there was no condescension in her voice, only panic. "There seems to be some kind of misunderstanding with the venue. They're saying the final payment hasn't been authorized. Surely this is a clerical error?" "There's no error, Margaret," I said calmly. "I'm the account holder. I chose not to authorize the payment." There was a long silence on the line. Then her voice sharpened. "Eleanor, the ceremony starts in 3 hours. Guests are already arriving. You cannot possibly do this." "I'm not doing anything," I replied. "I simply chose not to fund a wedding where I was told my presence would ruin the aesthetic. If I'm not fit to walk through those doors as a guest, then I suppose the venue isn't fit to open them without my signature either." I heard her take a sharp breath. And then the line went dead. She had hung up on me. My phone rang again almost immediately. This time it was Claire. I almost didn't answer. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of finally, after 65 years, standing my ground. But I answered, because whatever else had happened between us, she was still my daughter, and some part of me needed to hear her voice. "Mom," Claire said, and I could hear the tremble underneath her words. The sound of a bride standing in her wedding dress somewhere, makeup half done. Phone pressed to her ear in growing horror. "Mom, what is happening?" "Diane says the payment isn't going through. The florist is asking if they should stop setting up." "Mom, please, whatever this is, can we talk about it after the wedding?" "We could have talked about it 3 days ago, Claire," I said quietly, when you told me I wasn't welcome. That's not Mom. I never said you weren't welcome. I said the ceremony photos. You said I look too old, Claire. You said I don't fit the aesthetic. You didn't invite me to my own daughter's wedding ceremony, but you expected me to fund it in full. Do you understand how that sounds? There was silence on the other end, a long, aching silence. And then, quietly, broken, Claire said the words I had been waiting 3 days to hear. I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry. But an apology over the phone, spoken in a moment of desperation, is not always the same as a true apology. I had learned that lesson from watching too many patients and too many families over the years. So I told Claire gently but firmly that we would talk, but not while the entire venue was in chaos, and not while I was simply a name on a check to be reactivated the moment there was a crisis. I hung up, and within 10 minutes my phone rang a third time. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. Mrs. Whitfield, this is David Ashcroft. I'm the family attorney representing the Whitfield-Sinclair wedding arrangements. His voice was clipped, professional, but underneath it I could hear something close to panic. I understand there's a dispute regarding the venue payment. I want to make sure we resolve this quickly and avoid any complications. I almost laughed. Complications. As if being told I ruined the aesthetic wasn't a complication. As if being erased from my own daughter's ceremony wasn't a complication. Mr. Ashcroft, I said calmly, I'm not disputing anything. I am simply choosing, within my legal right as the sole signatory on this contract, not to authorize a payment. There's no dispute. There's a decision. Mrs. Whitfield, I understand emotions are high, but legally speaking, if the venue does not receive payment by noon, they are within their rights to lock the ceremony hall and withhold catering services. 200 guests are already en route. This could become a very public situation. And there it was, the real fear. Not that I was hurt, not that a mother had been humiliated 3 days before her daughter's wedding. The fear was public embarrassment. The fear was 200 guests, including Margaret's carefully curated social circle, arriving to find locked doors and an empty ballroom. I took a breath, and I said something I had been holding inside for 3 days, maybe longer, maybe my entire life. Mr. Ashcroft, I understand your concern, but let me explain something clearly, so there's no confusion. I have spent 30 years sacrificing everything I had for my daughter. I sold my mother's wedding ring to send her on a school trip. I worked double shifts for over a decade to pay for her college, debt-free. I drained my retirement and remortgaged my home to pay a $50,000 deposit for a wedding I was then told I wasn't welcome to attend. If 200 guests arrived to locked doors today, the person responsible for that is not me. It is whoever decided a mother's presence would ruin the aesthetic of a day she paid for. There was a long silence on the phone. I understand, he said, finally quieter now. What would you need to see happen, Mrs. Whitfield, in order to release the payment? I told him exactly what I needed. Not money, not an apology written by a lawyer and read off a script. I needed my daughter, in person, to come find me, not call, not text, not send an attorney and speak to me herself, honestly, before I would even consider releasing another dollar. 20 minutes later, Claire arrived at the small office where I was sitting with Diane. She was still in her wedding dress, veil pinned back messily, mascara streaked slightly down one cheek. Margaret trailed behind her, though I noticed she stayed just outside the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. Claire knelt down in front of the chair where I was sitting my daughter, in a $15,000 wedding gown, kneeling on a marble floor in front of her 65-year-old mother. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking completely now, "I don't care about the aesthetic. I don't care about the photos. I was scared. I was scared of disappointing Julian's family, of not fitting into their world, and I took that fear out on the one person who has never once made me feel like I didn't belong anywhere. You gave up everything for me, everything, and I told you that you weren't good enough to stand in the room. I am so sorry. I don't want to marry Julian today if it means marrying into a family that doesn't understand what you mean to me." I looked at my daughter, mascara running, veil crooked, and for a moment I didn't see the curated bride from the wedding magazines. I saw the 4-year-old girl whose father walked out the door and never came back. I saw the 8-year-old who cried when she didn't understand why we couldn't afford things other kids had. I saw the 18-year-old who hugged me at graduation and said, "We did this together, Mom." I reached down and took her hands. "I'm not angry that you fell in love with a life different from the one I gave you," I said softly. "I'm not even angry that Julian's family has more money than we ever will. What broke my heart, Claire, was being told that after everything, I still wasn't enough to be seen. That's not about aesthetics, that's about worth. And I needed you to understand that before I said yes to anything else." Claire was crying fully now, and honestly so was I. "Please, Mom," she said, "please come to my wedding. Not the reception, the ceremony. Walk me down the aisle. You promised me you would years ago, and I want that more than I want any of this. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because this isn't a story about petty revenge or burning bridges for the sake of drama. This is a story about a mother finally being seen. I authorized the final payment that day, not because I was forced to, not because a lawyer pressured me, but because my daughter chose, in her own words, in her own moment of clarity, to fight for me the way I had spent 30 years fighting for her. But something did change permanently that day, and it needed to. Margaret never apologized. Not directly, not really. She offered a stiff formal comment later that afternoon about misunderstandings and high emotions, the kind of almost apology people give when they're sorry about the consequences, not the action. I accepted it politely, because I am not interested in carrying bitterness for the rest of my life. But I also never forgot it. The ceremony started 45 minutes late. 200 guests sat in that beautiful garden, fanning themselves with programs, whispering about the delay, having no idea what had almost happened just an hour earlier. And then the doors opened. Claire walked down that aisle with her arm linked through mine. Not Julian's father, not some family friend chosen for optics. Me, her mother. 65 years old, wearing a simple gray coat over black, standing exactly where I had always dreamed I would stand. I heard a few quiet gasps from Margaret's side of the garden, not of disapproval, I think, but of surprise, maybe even quiet respect. I didn't care either way. I wasn't there for the aesthetic. I was there because I had earned that walk with 30 years of sacrifice, and no curated photo list was ever going to take that from me again. I think about that day often. Not with anger anymore, with a strange kind of gratitude. Because here is what I learned at 65 years old. After a lifetime of quietly giving everything I had to the people I loved, Love without boundaries isn't love. It's erasure. And the people who truly love you will never ask you to disappear, so their picture looks a little cleaner. For years, I believed that being a good mother meant sacrificing endlessly and asking for nothing in return. And there is beauty in sacrifice, real beauty, the kind that raises children into good, capable adults. But sacrifice without respect is not a relationship. It is a transaction where one person keeps paying and the other keeps taking until there's nothing left to give. I don't regret a single year of double shifts or the wedding ring I sold or the retirement fund I gave up so my daughter could have a life I never had. I would do all of it again without hesitation. What I will never do again is stay quiet while someone I love tells me I don't belong in the room I built. If you are watching this, and you recognize yourself in this story, if you have given endlessly to someone who has started treating your presence as an inconvenience rather than a gift, I want you to hear something clearly. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to ask for respect. You are allowed to hold your ground quietly, without shouting, without cruelty, and still change everything. Because sometimes the loudest form of love isn't showing up and staying silent. Sometimes it's a single folded note handed to the right person at exactly the right moment, reminding everyone, gently but firmly, exactly who you are and exactly what you deserve. My daughter and I are still healing. It hasn't been perfect since that day. Trust, once broken, takes far longer to rebuild than it took to break. But we are trying. And for the first time in a long while, she calls me not out of obligation, but because she wants to hear my voice. And every time she does, I remember standing in that small office at Ashford Manor holding a single envelope in my hands, finally understanding that my worth was never something anyone else had the right to decide. It was mine all along.